You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Hello, welcome to episode 7 of the Penteract Poetry Podcast. My guest this time is Rachel Smith, an artist working on the border of poetry and the visual arts. I spoke with Rachel a few weeks ago, and we discussed her various creative processes, the worlds of art and poetry, and the importance of being insolent yet smitten. I began by asking what led her to the arts.
Well, I suppose what led me to art is just I've always used drawing, I think, as a way of coming to understand the world. So even from a very, very early age, I always had a paintbrush or a pencil in my hands. So I guess I've always made images as a way just of figuring out what is around me. And then as I've sort of developed my process, this has become much more about drawing and writing and photography as well. There are some lovely images that I've got. I used them at a talk or a few years ago now that were my very first photographs taken on a box brownie, which obviously I think it was my grandma's. And I couldn't have been very old, probably 4 or 5 at the time. And one of the lovely things about them is the fact that because obviously I was quite small, and you have to pull that lever down to kind of get it to take the photograph. All of the photographs are on about a 45-degree angle. So everything is kind of this sloping scene that's taken. And I guess in some respects, those speak volumes about what I'm interested in now as an artist, in that idea of process and what happens and how images get made or how words come together on a page, and that material process that is involved in it. And particularly, and I guess we'll talk about this more, but the idea of error and how important error and accident is to the way I make my work. I mean, I think the other thing that has come to mind more recently is that I've often been fascinated with words and text as well as image. But it turns out that, I mean, I've been sort of 6 years studying to research my PhD. But turns out I'm dyslexic or have a neurodiverse brain, as is the common way of describing it these days. But I think I've been trying to figure that out my whole life without realising, because that was a very late kind of discovery at the age of 40 something. And so, yeah, I think my fascination with words and text and taking things apart and putting them back together very much comes from trying to figure out how other people make sense of the world and how I make sense in comparison. So I think all of that sits under the way that I draw, the way I photograph things, and the way I write. And what most interests me at the moment is how those things are combined.
So you learned that you're dyslexic. How did that happen? How did what was the spark? How did you suddenly realise that was going on?
Well, to be fair, it was literally through the process of starting to do the PhD. So I did my degree very sort of in the 90s, and I did a fine art degree, and I ended up in sculpture, bizarrely, even though I thought I was a painter. So I've spent a lot of time, in fact, if I look at any of my art education, I've spent a lot of time thinking I was doing one thing and other people kind of pushing me into another box. So I never necessarily feel very comfortable in any of the sort of genres or material processes. I'm always slipping through the cracks or working in the spaces in between. And so I had a long period after my degree where I wasn't really interested in the arts at all. And I sort of threw myself into my career and did lots of other things, and got involved in education and thinking about other people's artistic processes rather than my own. And then I went back to study in the sort of 2010, I went back and started an MA. And then after that, fell into the PhD, really, because I didn't want to stop. And so this is a very long-winded way of saying that when, as part of the PhD, it was all going fine until it got to the bit where you have to tackle this 40,000 word document of text. And after several meetings with my supervisors that were just like, either you're not trying very hard, or there's something that when you talk about your work, you can talk about it really eloquently and well, and you can explain yourself. And the minute you start to write down, it's all over the place. And I think I'd used constraint-based processes and ideas around sort of Deleuze's rhizomatic structure of everything being connected for quite a long time to hide the fact that I couldn't write in a flowing manner that other people could do. And so at that point they said, maybe you might want to go for a dyslexic test. And then we ended up there, and it was kind of like, and then you have to go back and retrofit everything, and it makes sense of things in so many different ways that I'd thought that I was odd, or I had to hide things, or probably I wasn't very clever, or lots and lots of things that have just sort of opened up since then. And you just go, oh, right, okay. And there was a horrible moment, I think, as well for me when the PhD nearly disappeared, because I just thought, oh, well, it just turns out I was trying to figure out that. So now I figured that out, I probably don't need to do the PhD, but that's not true. But there are those moments of sort of anxiety when you think, oh, gosh, this isn't about anybody else. It's literally just about that, figuring that out.
So it's remarkable, really, that you were led to Deleuze and all these post-structuralist philosophers.
Yeah.
That seems like quite an extreme response. You choose to burden yourself with this difficult French philosophy.
Yeah.
Just to overcome this problem.
My supervisor's had a good laugh about that, let me tell you. She's like, seriously, why have you chosen this? But I guess, yeah, it is about that figuring out again, really, really trying to wrestle with complexity. And I guess that's where a lot of ambiguity comes into my work, because there is room for that kind of level of wrestling. There's a lot of wrestling goes on in my work, I think. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your work then. It's
okay.
Do you think of it as post-structuralist, or do you think of it as asemic? How would you describe it?
I think in some ways it is sometimes post-structuralist. I think you could describe it as that, although I don't like things that sit in one position. I think one of the things that I am really interested in, and why I make work, and what drives me to make work, is constantly pushing things and moving things in different directions. And movement for me is key in the way I make work, in the way the processes switch between drawing and photography and writing, and trying to see photography as poetry, and maybe poetry as drawing, and thinking of those things being not static. There's a lovely, I can't remember who it is now, it might be Latour, but there's somebody who talks about post-structuralism and deconstruction, but it's the way they use, it's D-construction, so that it is about this kind of breaking down but building up again. And I think when I was thinking about talking to you today, I was thinking about taking a delight in dismantling things, a bit like a child would take a watch to pieces to try to figure it out. And then you end up with this kind of excess that doesn't quite fit back in. And I think, in a way, some of the things that I do are a bit like that. But I've always been very interested in sort of conceptual work and constraint-based working. But somehow my work never ends up looking quite like that. But I think that is because, again, I've always been interested in sort of some of the ideas that have been said about impure conceptualism, where editing starts to creep into the process, or just by nature of who I am and the way that I work, error or faulty memory comes into play and breaks the process. So although I often start with the best intentions and work with lots of constraints, they end up becoming much more ad hoc than perhaps I might have liked. But I've learned to kind of embrace that and use that as a tool to kind of explore the tension between things that are fixed and things that are completely chaotic. I don't know whether that even answers the question now, but
I think so. What it does have in common with constraint-based work is it's about potential. There seems to be this great idea of what language can be, or what writing can be.
Yeah, and sort of the idea that words, what I love best, I'm really interested in metaphor, and the fact that words mean so many different things all at the same time, and how you can use that to sort of play with image or meaning, or the way the audience might interpret what you're trying to say. Because I think a lot of my work is quite a little bit abstract, certainly ambiguous sometimes. It's very fragmentary. A lot of my text and my images, I guess, are about cutting things up and almost collaging things together and appropriating fragments from different places. So yeah.
Hence the use of photography alongside writing.
Yeah, and sort of hand annotations. I'm very interested in the sort of tension between the digital space and the handwritten space. So again, I've been quite interested in doing a lot of work around marginalia or handwriting in the margins or note sort of annotations of text and things, because I think one of the things that really fascinates me is the way that in some respects, I think the way we write in a digital workspace tends to hide the process. It tends to hide all the mess and the error, and we get this kind of unreal feeling of seeing the finished work almost immediately, even though it isn't. Because I remember, again, being an A-level student and doing English years ago, and everything was just handwritten on lined paper, and you used to physically cut up your essay and write lots of stars, and then it used to be pinned all over the wall as I was trying to structure it. Whereas now, any word processing program just does that automatically. And so I am interested in kind of opening up a space to think, because I find that more and more in the world, we're supposed to think faster and quicker and come up with a response instantly. And I like to take time and look for all of those invisible processes that we don't necessarily focus on and what they might show us about the way we are constructing any kind of sense.
Yeah, so it's about process, about revealing the process and the hidden dimensions. When I was thinking about this, doing this interview, I was reminded of Italo Calvino's "If on the Winter's Night a Traveller," and I think it's in that book where he talks about how he's a slow reader, not because he reads the words slowly, but because at the end of every sentence, he's got all the connotations of the sentence, all the things that reminds him of come to mind, and that's distraction, isn't it? Which is, of course, a huge part of your work.
Absolutely. And there's been one phrase that has really stuck with me that I read when Roland Barthes was writing about his reading process and trying to come up with this very systematic way of reading a text and sort of deconstructing it, I guess. And he talks about being insolent but smitten, and I love that. It really spoke to me, and he writes about whenever we read, when we look up from the text, we're still constructing language, not because we aren't enjoying it or because we're not engaged with it, but because it generates so much. But this idea that you are insolent because you are creating your own response or language while reading, and then smitten because you keep returning to the text. And I think, again, that sort of tension between being in love with some of these texts that I'm working with, but then also breaking them into pieces and being quite cavalier, I guess, with the way that I am appropriating them, I think is quite interesting.
So would you like to describe some of the actual methods you've used? Do you like to keep them a secret, or?
No, not at all. I mean, I will often list things. I'm very interested in the way that you make work, because I love that obsessive quality about it as well. And there are, I wrote a piece that was, I did as a collaboration. I work collaboratively quite a lot, actually, but I'll come back to that. And there were three of us working on some Bananarama lyrics. It was very frivolous, but actually it turned out to be really productive. And so we agreed that what we wanted to do was to use some of their lyrics and to then use that as a tool to generate a new piece of work. And so we were all going to choose a song and sort of use that particular song. And so the work that I chose was Cruel Summer. I don't know whether you're old enough to remember such things.
It's not a band I'd be familiar with.
No. Anyway. The title of the song is Cruel Summer. But then I guess what interested me then, because again, my obsessive brain, so then it was about what number letter is C in the alphabet and S, and then I wanted to think about the other months of the other seasons in the year, but transpose the that relation. So it became Cruel Summer then becomes Kind Autumn, Guilty Winter, Cautious Spring, because we're kind of transposing those things. But then it's about memory, and it's about thinking back to those times when I was listening to that song. And then there's also song lyrics that appear, and then there'll be other bits that are appropriated from every. So it is a gathering process, I guess. But yes, I'm very interested in lists. I use a lot of lists, or I'll very often start by looking at a page of text and just take the first letter of every single line. Or I will sometimes allow myself to start by being distracted and just allow my eye to wander across the page. I did a project once that was about trying to find sense in texts that just by looking at other people's found bookmarks. And I went up to the art college library in Leeds to do that, because I'd had this experience of a library in Sheffield, and the books were absolutely full of other people writing in the books and these little post-it notes or bits of scraps of paper that had been left. And I was just fascinated by the fact that they would leave them in the books, and why those pages, because sometimes they were completely blank and you couldn't tell. So I went up, I proposed this as a residency for the Leeds College of Art Library. And they were like, yeah, that's great, come up and do that. And again, I would propose to take all these photographs and make notes. But what was amazing was the fact that when I arrived, the librarian, Nick Norton, who was absolutely fantastic, but he was really, really anxious and had kind of almost already got all of these books out, because they clean their books in a way that this library where I had been working don't. So they actually rub out any annotations and they remove all of those bookmarks. And so he was kind of like, please, whatever it is you want to do with them, that's fine, but can you please do it? Because so instead of having this experience where I thought I would just meander around the library and look for coloured things sticking up out of these books, they were there already. So that was really interesting to me. And I began to think about how people value books and what they're valued for, and whether it's the object itself or the ideas within it. And again, that reflects some of what I'm interested in my practice, in terms of that material object of the book or the content and the conceptual ideas that it contains.
Yeah, again, that's hidden dimensions.
Yeah.
Seems to be a theme. One thing about distraction, you say that you allowed yourself to become distracted. What does that mean? I mean, so that's more like meandering, your thoughts meandering as you focus on something. Do you ever directly try to be distracted? For example, set an alarm, or
that's
something
really
come up to you.
Yeah, no, I guess I've had to work in a way to allow myself the room for when those distractions occur, that it's okay. Because for a long time I think I felt that it wasn't okay to be distracted, and reading should be this very serious thing that we, and so it's a little bit like, I remember, again, going back to when I was a child, I remember, I don't know, watching Blue Peter while doing my homework, and then the teacher being really angry because suddenly in the middle of this essay there was a little bit of, I'd written down some quotes from Blue Peter accidentally, just because obviously I was listening and couldn't listen and write what I was thinking at the same time. And it becomes this interesting, I don't know, breakage, I suppose. It's a way of breaking things. And I guess, yeah, I am interested in that. I did another project years ago where I was trying to write down sound. So listening to radio or television and trying to write it. And the fact that you can't handwrite that as fast as you can hear it breaks that process, and it becomes quite fragmentary, and then it just becomes this jumble. But it reveals something interesting because of the way the words then start to attach each other to different sentences, and you get half a sentence of this and half a sentence of that, and suddenly the meaning changes, but people recognize things in there that are perhaps interesting in a different way.
Yeah, well, this brings us on to the subject of writing as visual art.
Yeah.
Which is another strong element in your work. So this is the asemic.
Yeah.
Or asemic. I'm not sure how to pronounce that.
Yeah, no. I'm with you on that one. However you want. There is always something about words that you see that I've only ever seen written down, and then when you speak them, yeah, I love that.
I suppose it's related to what we're talking about.
It is really, isn't it?
Another error.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I've always considered myself a visual artist. And so although we're talking a lot about the way I think about words and come together and write, it's what interests me is the way you can put those processes together, because I am still somebody who mainly takes photographs and mainly draws, but I guess has done a lot more writing recently. And one of the things that interests me is the difficulty actually of trying to get those things to synthesize together, because it's much more easy to separate them out and sort of do just writing and just because people sort of respond in a different way to that, and they can more easily understand what is happening. And so sometimes it becomes very, very difficult sometimes to describe my practice, because it is, people say, oh, but you're a photographer, and then they'll do this and they'll be like, well, why are you doing that? Why is your work there just text? And so some of what I'm trying to develop is how you use photography in amongst the writing and in amongst the drawing, and it's challenging. Again, that interests me just because it's difficult. I'm just very contrary, and I like to make things difficult for myself.
Yeah, and people like categories, don't they? It's very strange. They want you to be a certain thing, and they don't like it when you prove yourself to be something else.
Yeah, and yet that's just, I love sort of hybridity, and I that really interests me. I like to, when I look at other people's work, and the people who are hard to categorize to me are the most interesting, because I guess it's because you never really have a comfort zone in a way. I think there are a lot of really interesting artists, but you almost, when you see them make work, you kind of know what's coming. And therefore I don't engage in the same way, not necessarily because the work isn't good, it's just because I know what I'm expecting. And so if I go to see an exhibition of their work, I kind of know what's coming. And so I like to be surprised, maybe confused. Maybe I've just come to terms with the fact that I spend my life being confused, and that's okay.
Yeah, embrace the confusion. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. But it is interesting because obviously, I'm very interested in what you do at Penteract Press and all the constraint-based work. And I suppose, I do see my work sitting in amongst all of that. But then at the same time, I am sometimes aware of the fact that it doesn't play by the rules. And I do like to play by the rules as well, while still looking like I don't care. I really do.
There is a post-structuralist idea that the writing is, in a sense, more in control of the writer than the other way around. And I think that's there in constraint-based poetry, certainly. When I'm writing an anagram poem, I'm doing what the letters tell me to some extent. I'm not entirely in control. So that's another connection between what I do and what you do. Have you ever thought about starting a poetic movement based around your ideas? Because you're very knowledgeable about aesthetic philosophy.
Thank you.
Do you see a space for what you're doing and some way to bring people together under a banner?
Yeah, I mean, it's something, I think, particularly because obviously it's on my mind that I'm coming to the end of the PhD research, and in a way that's been a really good focusing tool for quite such a long time now, because obviously doing it part-time, it takes 6 years, and coming to the end and seeing the end of that and thinking, well, what next? I mean, I'm not under any illusion that suddenly I'm going to, set up some kind of poetic movement and everyone's going to suddenly follow me, because that's never going to happen. But yeah, you're right. And I think one of the things that sort of came out of some of the research was that I was really interested in this idea of what reading and writing and making might be as a process. And it is quite hard to list as a set of constraints or processes, but something that is that kind of disruptively devoted, or as Bart would say, insolent but smitten, something that is about reading as writing and writing as making, and making my way through texts as a way of understanding things. So, and I think if I was to set up some kind of poetic movement, it would be rhizomatic. So it would have to be non-hierarchical, because I'm very into that idea that everything is just as important as everything else. And so nothing gets to be at the top of the list. It always has to take a turn at the bottom. And I'm very interested in that kind of sort of DIY sensibility of just using the tools that we've got at hand, and not necessarily waiting for the perfect strategy or thing, just starting with what we've got and then seeing where that goes. And collaboration. I think, as I mentioned that before, I think collaboration is really, really important to me. And I love the fact that when you pass work back and forward between people, something extra happens that neither of you could foresee. And so again, it's that element of surprise or something hidden revealing itself in that kind of working together or with and a back and forth process. So yeah, do you want to join?
Am I invited?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I'd be happy
totally.
Yeah, I always feel like I should be collaborating more. But when it works, it's such a great thing.
I think I'm very lucky in some respects, because some of the work that I've done collaboratively was with some friends that I met on the MA, and we have worked together for a long time now, and we trust each other implicitly, and we can take risks because of that, because we are generous and we are careful, but we are respectful, but also in amongst that we are quite brutal with each other's work and allow each other to be. I think the hardest thing about collaboration is developing that sort of trust in the process, that you feel able to hand your work over to somebody to deliberately almost break it in order to make space for the other person. Because I've been working on something since lockdown with a friend who I've known for quite a long time, and we've toyed with the idea of doing something, and we're finally getting there now, just because I think we're in lockdown. And but it's been quite tentative to start with, and I don't think he'll mind me saying that, but we're getting there now, because you somehow build that level of trust, so it and can see the way that your work might fit together, and sometimes that can be really hard to do, but it is very rewarding when you get there.
Where do you see your work standing alongside current trends in poetry and in art? Do you see yourself as an outsider? I
mean, I don't think I can see myself completely as an outsider, because there are other people doing things that I recognise. But it is interesting when you step across those boundaries. You know, when you, I think I remember an experience when I first went, and when I was first described as a poet, and it was like, I was like, what? And I went.
You took it as a compliment. No,
I did. I really did. But it was a really, you know, it was like, oh, and other artists aren't always so positive sometimes. It's weird. But no, I went across to the other room in Manchester. I don't know whether you know sort of Tom Jenks and James Davis and Scott Thurston. And I went, because I'd met them somewhere in London and done a performative reading. And then they said, oh yeah, come across and do something. And then obviously it is a poetry night. And I was like, I'd never really thought about what I do as fitting here. And what interests me again is that the discussions around the work are quite different. And the sort of the things that poets talk about and think about are different than the things that artists think about. There are a lot of overlaps, but there's terminology around things, and there are sort of ways of thinking that are really quite different. And that really interests me. And when you step into one world and then step back into another, I think, again, it's what you bring from one space into another, and then what you take back. And the more we blur those boundaries, I think that the better, really.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating.
I'm really sorry, I've totally forgotten what the question was now. I've gone off on one. Sorry.
That's okay. No, that's what you just said. It's fascinating. I want to know more about this. Do you have examples of the different ways that artists and poets think?
I suppose in some ways the idea of performance and the idea of voice is something that comes across differently. And I think, I mean, without getting my head shut off here, sorry, but I think poets do have a voice, that there is a very particular way of that they see as sort of not a personal voice. There is a way of reading that I have noticed, which is really interesting to me, in that kind of like the way that sometimes artists will try and step back and use objective language about their work and so on. And I think the way people sort of perform and talk about their work is different. It's hard to think of a really specific example, but yeah, I just remember at the time, at that very moment when I went and made and sort of read my work, and I was very early in my stepping out into the world of actually reading work aloud. I've always seen it as a visual thing on the page, and so sort of experimenting with that, and yeah, we had a lot of discussions that night about voice and how you use your voice and your accent and all of those kinds of things, and how you try to make that either neutral or use it in a particular way, which I'd never really thought about before, which was really, really interesting. It was also one of the things I was really, really concerned about coming on this, because I hate the sound of my own voice, and I'm very, very aware of how northern I sound, particularly when recorded. But anyway.
I don't think there's anyone who likes the sound of their own voice.
No.
Well, maybe a few people, but most of us don't.
No.
Yes, I tend to categorize my poems along the lines of the ones that I can read publicly and the ones I must never read publicly, because, and it's not necessarily that they're not as good. They are for the page alone, and they shouldn't be spoken out loud.
Yeah, and I think I was asked to speak or read something at an event in Sheffield, And you suddenly realize that actually that I've got a lot of stuff that people say, oh, you should read that, and you go, no, I don't think I can. I don't know. It is very much to be looked at and read, and you do read it, but it can't be read out loud in the same way. It doesn't work. It's interesting. That is something that I'm interested to explore a lot more as my work goes forward, in terms of what can be and how we might read some of the stuff that I make, and maybe trying to deliberately push and adapt some of the stuff that is visual into, well, how would you read that, or how could you adapt it so that it could be read? Because that is a really interesting thing, the stuff that is, we do assume is just visual.
A lot of your work has been done for the purpose of your PhD. But beyond that, there is the wider world of poetry and art. So how have you tried to share your work beyond your academic career?
To be fair, sometimes I feel quite badly. I think it was something that I'd started to almost become much more productive and able to do that. And I was quite engaged in Twitter and social media, and I found that incredibly useful in the past. And as I sort of started to finish the MA, I was getting my work out into the world a lot more. And then I think with the constraints of the PhD, it's become much more insular, and not intentionally, just because you're trying to juggle the research and holding down a job and all of these other things. And suddenly actually promoting yourself and the work becomes almost the thing that can be let go, which is, and then you sort of think, and now I'm starting to emerge from that and thinking, crikey, I need to think of a way of starting to build that up again, because I have become quite insular in that, and that's not something that I wanted to necessarily do. It's part of, just making the work. But I think some of the work that I've made on the PhD has certainly gone out into book fairs through various different sort of artist projects. So a couple of the books that I made were generously sort of taken up by A.M. Bruno artist projects, and that's a really lovely set of people who are interested in making books and artist books and talking about the page and the material of making books. And so I've been lucky enough to sort of be involved with a couple of their projects, which again have involved then going out and sitting on book fair tables and talking to people, and in a way that's one of the nicest things, is getting to speak to an interested audience, which is it's really hard to find sometimes, is trying to find people who want to talk about your work. And I think, read it, poetry readings and things like that, again, it's really, people are very, very generous, and people want to listen to what you've got to say, and then the discussions that happen afterwards are always amazing. And so, I mean, it is something that I've been talking with a friend who's also based in Sheffield, and we would love to set something up in Sheffield, and fingers crossed that might actually sort of happen. But again, it's a big commitment to sort of then run that, to keep that going. I understand, I realise that it's a big commitment, and there's a lot of admin to kind of get those things going. But it's nice to think that you can bring people together who are interested in similar things and talk about each other's work and present it in that way. But I mean, you are the master of poetry on Twitter. I need to learn.
If you insist.
No, but I mean, and I think it is. I think that the social media platforms are brilliant in terms of actually reaching people and getting at people who maybe don't normally engage with book fairs and poetry readings and those kind of things.
You need both, though. I mean, we found we haven't been to too many book fairs or readings, but we found that it does complement the online side very well. Of course, at the moment, we only have the online side.
Yeah.
But you again, you walking in two worlds here, the art world and the poetry world. That should give you a decent number of opportunities.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm hoping that I've got various sort of bits of work at the moment that are sort of expanding from where I stopped the PhD. And I say it like that because the way that I make work and the sort of process that it goes through is it never, or it very rarely sits in one form. And so some of the work that I've made does become a book and it goes out there into the world as a book, but then the drawings that have and the writing that's in the book could be exhibited as a piece of work that would sit on a wall, and or it might be developed in another way. So a lot of my work gets remade or rethought as I add other bits in. So yeah, I think there are some things that I've kind of stopped in terms of the PhD has ended, and they are as they are. But I know that I want to kind of almost break them open again and rework them in a different form. So yeah, I've got one or two things on the go at the minute.
Well, going back to social media, then you said do you call me king of Twitter or the master of Twitter? Something?
You can wear that crown.
I'll take them all. I'm not so good with other social media, actually. I only really use Twitter. But it strikes me that with what you do, maybe something like Instagram is better. Something that's more visual based. Do you use Instagram?
No. No. But yeah, I have been told that, and really. And also in lockdown, that should be one of my main tasks, is setting up an Instagram account, really, because I've had lots of people say you really need to be on Instagram, and I just say yeah. Mm-hmm. But yes, that is one of it's on my to-do list, and yes, because I think now it is time to sort of start putting stuff out and drip feeding and I think one of the things I've learned and I've begun to love is that I'm quite okay about putting out work before it's necessarily finished, in inverted commas, whatever that might mean, and so that things can go out. I feel a lot more comfortable about just putting things out that are ongoing, or I'm not sure it is finished, because of the fact that my process, things get folded back in all the time, and so one thing will become made, and then I will add maybe then drawings to a piece of text that exists, or text gets put into photographs, or photographs get cut to pieces, and then so things are constantly being remade and returned. So yeah, and I think then that you can start to put things out on social media, hopefully, and we'll see what comes back. But yeah,
you can use social media as a notepad.
Yeah.
And you actually get feedback based on your notes. And something like Twitter in particular, you send out a tweet and then it's buried in a few hours.
Yeah.
So if it was a bad poem, you can just work on it again and post it in a few weeks.
Yeah. And I do like that kind of idea of things just being reworked in public. I think one of the things as well that I really enjoyed about some of the work that I made on the PhD was that a lot of the time, because I wanted to find a space to work, in terms of maybe a studio or whatever, some of the residencies that I have done over the sort of the last 6 years have been about applying to a gallery space to sit and work and make the work in public, and not be afraid of the fact that I'm not turning up with a finished product. It's more about things being in process and being in transition and talking to people and just revealing the process of actually making within a gallery space, and turning that space from being something that's pristine and finished into just more like a studio, and seeing what happens, because that is more interesting to me than just kind of standing back from something and going, there you go, that's me done, I don't need to look at that again, because our context is constantly changing, and any object for me is always in a process of change, no matter at what stage it is. It might have been made, but then it becomes dog-eared, or it becomes rusty, or it's constantly a process of change, and so my work is similar.
Yeah, well, then I don't understand why you're not embracing Twitter and Instagram, because it has that quality, and especially now with the lockdown, it's difficult to do things physically. Although before we started recording, we were saying that we think social media has gone a bit quiet because of people not wanting to look at the bad news. Yeah, maybe that will change, and it's certainly now an opportunity for people to get more active online.
Yeah, it is, and I think at the moment I feel a little bit in limbo, simply because, as I say, I've the PhD has been finished and handed in, but the Viva is still 4 weeks away now. So I kind of feel like once that has been done, then hopefully this space will open up, which can be incredibly productive. So tentative steps, but moving towards it.
Great. Well, we should talk about upcoming projects. One in particular, perhaps.
Are we allowed to talk about that? Yeah, I'd love to talk about that.
So this is the book that will be published by Penteract Press later in the year.
Which is excellent. And I'm really, really pleased that that's going to happen. And yeah, I mean, the book that you are publishing for me, it is the end of the PhD. It is the method that I have developed through entangling all of these processes that we've kind of hinted at and talked about, as a way of reading an existing text and almost putting into practice collaboration and reading and writing and making in one process. And so it is called read writing with brackets around the right bit, because it is, those brackets stand for the making process. And so it is trying to sort of acknowledge the fact that reading and writing and making for me are one singular process and what that might look like. And so it has come out of a very much more constrained book that I made, which was a reading of Jean-Paul Sartre's autobiography, Words. And I made that as one of the A.M. Bruno projects, which was just taking some of his fragments of his text and then responding to it in thinking about memories that occurred to me as I was reading, using Barthes' Insolent but Smitten kind of approach. But then having done that, it didn't seem enough. As I've said, most of my work gets remade and reworked. And so then it was like, well, yeah, but this is only my reading. And what is it to then include other people's readings in this process? And so I worked with two artists, Helen Frank and Madeline Walton, who we then passed our own readings of his initial text backwards and forwards. And so Madeline mainly works with text and Helen does a lot of drawing. And I sit somewhere in between using photography and the drawing and writing. But we basically passed work backwards and forwards remotely for several months before then coming together and working in a gallery space and actually looking at each other's processes and kind of cutting each other's work up and working into this. And then eventually that sort of project died back down, and it was a long time before I then came back to it and thought about, well, I want to use this work that we've got. And we came back together and did some more work on it, and they were very generous in their time. And then obviously some of the visual work that we've done collaboratively is then in the book, interspersed with fragments of my process or the description of what it is to read and write and make. Is that a fair description, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. What made you choose Sartre? Because he's a French philosopher, and you like you like French philosophers.
It was a very it was a much more straightforward decision than that. So when I was putting the proposal together initially for this other project, this call out for a set of artist books, and the title of the project as a whole was Words. So in my usual constrained based process type way at that point, I typed that into the internet to see if there were any books out there that had words, and there it popped up, Lemo Words by Jean-Paul Sartre. So I went, oh well, this is ideal, then I'll just get that. So it was literally as straightforward as that. Having said that, once I'd opened that book up and read it and engaged with it, it's a really interesting book because it's divided into two sections. One is reading, the first section is reading, and then the second section is titled Writing. And it is this sort of journey through his childhood and his memories and experience of reading and writing. And suddenly you're kind of like, wow, how did I not know this existed before? But yeah, it was completely by chance in a way, but also that kind of like, I just need to find something that has words in the title, and that was the first thing that popped up.
And it's wonderful when you get these great coincidences.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very much looking forward to seeing it in print.
Me too, and interested in a way that your printing press has offered me another constraint on it, because although it's very subtly at the moment as it sits, it is fractionally in colour. The fact that it's going to be black and white is quite interesting because it's making me play about with those images a little bit more to sort of flag up more of the tonal things of the images. So I'm having to sort of adjust my aesthetic, which is I'm really enjoying. It's added another layer of difficulty.
Good. That's what I like to do. So, yeah, I think of publishing as collaboration these days. It's something it didn't ever cross my mind until I started into it.
Yeah.
But it definitely has that dimension. So, and what else, more generally, what's in your future once the PhD is done? What sort of work do you think you'll be doing?
Well, I've started putting together a project that's about, I guess, a similar process to this one, because I think having made that work and talked about that as a method that I can use, I guess now what I want to do is to see if I can do that more freely without the constraints of trying to justify it as a piece of research, because there's still quite a difference between making an artwork or even a poem that isn't completely constricted by the fact that it needs to show it is doing something very particular. So I guess what is really exciting to me at the moment is kind of taking some of those things that I feel I've spent a long time thinking about and building a theoretical platform for, and then kind of going, right, and now nobody's watching in the same way or judging in the same way. So how can I now use that more freely? And so the thing I'm working on at the minute, which is still in the very early stages, but is a reading or a read writing journey through Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And I guess it goes back to perhaps the beginning of our conversation, and think because it was a book I studied at A-level, and to be fair, I loathed it. We used to go through it line by line in meticulous detail, trying to figure out the meaning behind every single word, until the point that I was just like, I don't know who this Virginia Woolf is, but frankly, I hate her. And of course I don't. That's just a ridiculous thing to say. But at the time, as somebody studying that with a very, very traditional, meticulous teacher, it seemed insane to read like that, because there was nothing enjoyable about trying to figure out what she meant by every single word. And I found it really difficult to believe that anybody would write a book thinking that much that we were having to think about it. Maybe people do, I don't know. I've never written a novel, and neither would I want to. But anyway, so I'm taking, I guess, a performative journey through her text and trying to think about, because I'm really interested in the character of Lily Briscoe, who is an artist, and how she sees the world, and that idea that that is repeated through the book. Women can't draw, women can't paint, and obviously it's looking at Victorian times, but you know, some of those suggestions that I've carried with me as a young woman through my career making art and stuff, and finding my place in the world as an artist. So it is an interesting book, and it's interesting going back to it now and remembering seeing what I remember from it and what I didn't, what I've forgotten, and drawing and taking photographs. And there's a really lovely moment in the text that did stay with me about how she moves the salt cellar on the tablecloth to remind her to move this image in her painting, and she wants to move the tree. And again, it's about artistic process. So I'm quite excited about that at the minute, but mainly just because nobody's telling me I need to do it, or I'm just doing it for myself at the minute.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. So a lot of the work you've been doing, you've had to see as an academic work.
Yeah.
That really must change it. But I mean, there's got to be some positives to that too, if it's making you think more deeply about certain aspects.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's given me a confidence in my work that I didn't have perhaps before, because it feels like I know how and why and what I'm making. And I think, which is in a way what I've done, is I've spent 6 years of research building a platform almost to put my work on. You know, we talk about that. You talked about the poetic movement, and I guess in a way I feel like I have constructed, all but shaky sometimes, this kind of territory of there's these theories and there's these artists and there's these poets and there's these writers, and I've kind of assembled them together and made this little platform that I kind of go, and this is, I'm standing on their, I sit on their shoulders, and they give me more confidence and grounding in what I'm going to do. But now I can do that more freely, perhaps. I'll let you know. Yeah. Come back to me in 6 months and I'll tell you how it's going.
It's interesting that you're going to be doing both, that you've done this very academic project, and now you're doing essentially, you know, a very similar thing, but with much more creative freedom.
Yeah, I hope it is as as good as I'm expecting. I feel really excited about it at the moment, but let's see if it gets as well received as I hope.
I'm sure it'll be fantastic.
Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been really good catching up and learning about your process.
Oh, thank you for having me, Anthony. It's been really enjoyable. And you're a very good interviewer and host. Thank you.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.